in executive session remains confidential until such time as the committee votes to bring it out.
That's right.
So, Brian, I haven't seen you since you grew a beard. Is this a COVID beard?
It's kind of a, everything beard, kind of working on something new.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's what we men call the winter scruff.
Yeah. A little more
Well,
of the stuff on.
I know a lot of people have been experimenting with COVID beards. Not that I could share that, but
I bet you could.
nah, not a chance. Hey, Mike, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Anybody?
Yes, we can, Ron.
Thank you. I'm in the council chamber, not the chamber. I'm in meeting room B.
Yeah.
It's easier for me to do the interviews from here.
Did that go well?
It went well. We can talk about it in executive session.
Yeah. Do you all I want to know is did everything work out okay?
Well, it worked out okay, but we will not yet have a recommendation for you.
Right.
Were these interviews for Board of Ed?
No.
For attorney.
Town attorney.
Oh, okay. It still is. Okay.
Ryan? Hello, Sam. For those of you who haven't met Brian Colbin before, he is, well, on my screen, he's on the far right. He's the one with the unruly beard.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you with your semi-unruly beard.
I'm trying to get it like yours.
Yeah.
If only I had the hair to go with it.
Well, there's a little maintenance in that,
Yeah.
He's hiding the rest of it under his hat.
Yeah.
Brian, are you with a real estate firm now? Because when I called you back, that was the answer.
Was that directed at me?
Yes.
What was the question?
Are you with a real estate firm now?
I work for Weicker Four Corners.
Okay.
Yes.
Brian and I used to see each other all the time in the library, but I didn't recognize him.
I worked there 27 years. Yeah.
There's a reason why people wear beards. They can vanish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let's see. We have Ryan and Charlie and me and Ron and Sam. So we're still don't have a quorum. Where is everybody? Oh, there's Ben. Hello, Ben.
Ron, was Ryan in there with you?
No, Ryan is back in his office now.
No, but I mean, when you first came in, was he in there?
When I first
I was helping Ron get the sound working.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So that was you then. Okay.
Hey, Terry.
One, two, three, four, five, six, and sort of seven, right?
7 straight up.
We're almost ready to go, but we have another minute.
I'm here, but I'm having some video issues.
I'm seeing 7 o'clock.
Here we go, 7 o'clock. All right, I will call.
Recording in progress.
I will call this meeting of the Mansfield Town Council to order. It is our November 22nd, 2021 meeting. And the first item of business is a roll call. Ms. Chain, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Osberger.
Here.
Berthelot.
Here.
Bruder.
Here.
Bertoni. Kotchenberger. Moran.
Here.
Shurin.
here.
Shaken.
Here.
Thank you.
And Mr. Frattoni arrived while you were announcing, and I believe Peter is about to join us as well. There he is. Mr. Kotchenberger is here. Okay. So the next item on our agenda is the opportunity for the public to address the council. Mr. Aylesworth, do we have any public?
Not aware of any members of the public looking to address the council tonight.
All right. Next item is your report, Mr. Aylesworth.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We had our 6th session of the Mansfield Local Government Academy this past week. We were at the library, and the participants in the program got a chance to learn all about our library services, which are many and varied. I think people who'd even been going to the library for many years and maybe even availing themselves of some of the programs and services were still stunned by some of the things they didn't know the library was offering. And so it was a very enjoyable session, and I think the library really knocked folks' proverbial socks off. So many kudos to Leslie and her team of enthusiastic librarians for all the work that they do. The next session will be on December 2nd. Obviously, no meeting this Thursday because of the Thanksgiving holiday. So December 2nd, we'll be focusing on shared services, and folks will have a chance to learn about finance and IT and facilities. It's hard to believe that we're coming up on already, but I guess this is part of what happens when you delay last year's budget later than normal. It's a quicker turnaround to next year's budget season. And so in the next couple of weeks, with help from finance, we'll be pushing out the comprehensive budget guidance for the FY22 budget season. That'll go out to all departments, and we'll obviously keep the council informed when that happens. But looking forward to the start of a new budget year, budget development process in December. Council should be aware, because it was in my report, that we are in the process of negotiating terms for a new multi-year service agreement with Mansfield Discovery Depot. The town's last contract for services with Mansfield Discovery Depot actually expired almost a year and a half ago. And so we're revisiting that now. And this is something that interfaces with a lot of town departments. There's public works and facilities and finance and HR and IT. And so there's definitely and varying degrees of labor and inputs, I'll call it. I think that the Discovery Depot leans a little heavier on some programs than others, but there's a lot of different programmatic areas that this touches on. And so we're revisiting the full scope of the services that MDD would like the town to provide, and making sure that we have indeed the bandwidth to be able to continue to do all these things. And to the extent there are any changes in the scope of some of these services, obviously have discussions around that. But this would be a multi-year agreement, and as such, it would be going before the council for ratification before things are finalized. So stay tuned for more updates on that front. On the topic of negotiations, just to touch on something that we'll talk about after the conclusion of this meeting tonight, and that's that representatives from the town management side of the equation and the collective bargaining unit representatives for both the public works employees and professional and technical employees. We had our last meeting a week ago Monday, or 1 week ago. And we had another productive session, actually culminated in the conclusion, I believe, of our negotiations. We reached terms on the final items that were outstanding, and Labor Council is working with their side to get everything drawn up, and the members of the unions have to still vote on things. But right now the expectation is that we will have new 3-year agreements in place very soon. And so probably the council meeting in December would be when you would all receive the actual new contract documents to vote on and ratify. But we'll have more discussion about that after the conclusion of this meeting tonight. We had our most recent meeting of the Town and Yukon Ad Hoc Working Group on a shared economic development framework, also on the 15th. This meeting actually focused more on the Yukon side of the equation. Sort of town goals and town aspirations had been a little bit more the focus of previous discussions. And so this gave Yukon a chance to tell us a little bit more about where they're looking to go. and specifically dive a little bit more into some components of their draft housing strategic plan, which was, I thought, useful and insightful. And we also talked a little bit about our sewer agreement, which is coming up for renewal and need to be renegotiated in the near future as well. So a lot of irons in the fire, and we continue to plug away and have some of these conversations that we need to have in the spirit of identifying shared goals and being candid with each other about where some of the differences of opinion on things may lie. I want to offer a very public and heartfelt thank you to everybody that was involved, which there were many people, many organizations involved in the production of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mural. Thank you to those members of the council. I know there were a few of you there that attended the unveiling event on November 13th, and we got just a fantastic weather day for it. It was a very iffy day weather-wise, but the morning really cooperated, so that was fantastic. Got to hear from a number of speakers to commemorate the important occasion, give thanks to everybody that was involved, and kind of raise everybody up in music and song, and just, you know, I won't touch on all the thank yous. I try to touch on as many people as I could think of in my report, but it really was, I think, a stirring tribute, and I'm just excited that's going to exist on in perpetuity on the facade of the community building, and tell everybody that comes through the doors or visits the general campus, as it were, what our town's all about and what our values are. So it really took a village to make that mural, and I think, you know, the final product is a great one. Let's see, I think just a few more things in the interest of time. On behalf of Human Services, just want to say that a couple different important meal programs and programs in general are in full swing. So the holiday program that happens around the Thanksgiving holidays in full swing. And as you can see in my report, tremendous amount of volume of foods are being distributed right now, and were distributed on November 17th at the open air distribution event. And then the Senior Center did its annual Thanksgiving luncheon via drive-through. Again, the format was done in a kind of COVID cooperative way. We had 90 seniors participate in that event. That was this past Friday. So the Senior Center and Human Services continue to do great things for our community and really step up in particular during the holiday season. There's a lot more going on in Human Services, especially around the holiday. So I'll leave you to read that in the report. But very, very proud of everything going on that front. As a family, the Ellsworth family got to enjoy the Nutcracker event over the weekend, and I understand it was the first time in the event's 18-year history that it was held outside. Very neat format. You know, basically three scenes, as it were, spaced out geographically around the Senior Center, and very, very impressed by that production. It's one of the things that makes Mansfield great, obviously, is our appreciation of arts and culture, and that was really great to see. I know the youngest members of our family were very enthralled, and I think we're already have ideas in their head about maybe trying out for a future installment of the Nutcracker. So that was great, and we have a lot obviously going on right now in terms of the holiday season and just the winter season on the horizon. I know I announced it last time, but just to reiterate, Winter Welcome is coming up on December 4th, and that event, of course, is put on by the partnership. So a lot of activities will be going on Saturday, December 4th, and hopefully as many residents of our community will come all to what's going on in the downtown stores area on December 4th. The library recently wrapped up its last of a series of planned focus groups, basically geared towards informing its ongoing strategic planning process. I know the library really wants to thank its patrons and members of the community that took part in that and provided insights to help shape the library's future direction. And for facilities, the Mansfield Middle School roof replacement project is moving along. It's about half done. This is not including the photovoltaic piece, but the actual roof project itself is about half done. And we did receive a complaint from an abutter complaining about odor issues. I think now that they're moving to work on a different part of the building, those issues, at least for that particular abutter, should subside. But we were working with them and trying to, with the vendors' help, find ways to contain some of that odor and basically, prevent more emissions, if you will, from troubling anybody's nose buds. But I think the situation is starting to resolve itself just based on where the future work is taking place. And I'm also happy to say that I think we are in the final steps, finally, of getting this much worked on request for proposals for the new Quint, the hybrid aerial pumper that the fire department is looking to procure with grant dollars, small cities grant dollars. We're still waiting on some final feedback from the state, but many thanks to Linda Painter, in particular, her staff in the planning department who've been doing yeoman's work. I know the fire chief, I know Fred would echo this, and finance would as well. Linda and her team, really have gone above and beyond when they have everything else going on that's kind of their normal day-to-day stuff that they do in a planning and zoning and development office. All the assistance they provided with this grant, which is of course very, very important for the town and significant investment for the town. Major thanks to Linda for, not that it's a surprise that she would go above and beyond, her or her staff, but it still bears saying and expressing that thanks. And I think I will end it there, unless there are any questions about anything I said or what's in my report.
Questions for the town manager, Ms. Strasburger?
Not a question, just a statement about the Martin Luther King mural. I did have a chance to go up to the town, the community center, and view it, and I think it's a wonderful representation for our community, and it came out great.
Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah.
The artist commented to me that she's done several of these, and one of the distinctive characteristics of Mansfield is she got lots of words to go on it, which I think is a classic comment on Mansfield. We definitely have lots of words. Any further questions for the town manager? All right, thank you, Mr. Aylesworth. Reports and comments of council members. I'll make a couple. I donated some gift cards to the holiday fund earlier today, and I do want to remind everybody that although the Thanksgiving programs are underway, they told me that nearly 150 families received food baskets. But there is a Christmas holiday or a Hanukkah holiday coming when it's not just a food issue, but also gifts for children. And the Human Service Office of Social Services is taking concrete things and gift cards, but primarily gift cards, in order to avoid the difficulty of handling things in a COVID environment. So I would really urge everybody to get gift cards, particularly from Mansfield businesses. Let's make this a two-sided effort, both boost our businesses and also provide some gifts for families who will have a hard time providing them. The other thing I wanted to say is that I just wanted to echo Mr. Aylesworth's comments about the mural. That was really an extraordinarily nice morning that we spent, full of dancing and music and wise words, and really inspiring. So those are my comments for this evening. Any other council member have reports or comments? Mr. Bruder.
Just real quick, I also attended the mural event, and I really appreciated all the work that everyone did to make that happen, and this is a reason why to be proud of Mansfield.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, the next item on our agenda is a consent agenda, and I am going to comment that there are a number of items on our agenda that could be very time consuming, and I would like people to keep your eyes on the time, please. Let's be as concise as possible. And a consent agenda with 4 items on it is a real step forward. The consent agenda includes an approval of minutes, a couple of appointments to town committees from the Committee on Committees, the dissolution of the Ad Hoc Committee on Affordable Work and Workforce Housing, since that committee is superseded, and the cancellation of December 27th. Mr. Osberger.
Mayor, at what point do we assign, is it after his approval for Brian? Do we assign Brian to the personnel?
I would assume that we can't assign him until he becomes a committee member, council member.
Right, and is that something we're going to start this evening, right?
That is further on the agenda, yes.
I see that, yep.
So, do I have any questions about the consent agenda? Would somebody like to move the consent agenda?
So moved.
Mr. Shuren, is there any way you can get a Zoom so that we can see you? You are very distant.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know who does that's available now, but if I play around, let me just, no,
okay.
I don't know if there's a Zoom feature on that or not, honestly.
yeah.
All right. Well, that means that if you want to raise your hand, you're going to have to wave wildly at me to make sure I see you. So, thank you.
Agenda.
So, Mr. Shuren moves the consent agenda. Mr. Bruder seconds. Any discussion of the consent agenda? Is anybody going to object to the consent agenda? Or abstain? Thank you. I declare the consent agenda has been adopted unanimously. And you are all excused from coming to a meeting 2 days after Christmas. Next is the COVID update. Mr. Aylesworth and Mr. Miller.
Happy to turn things over to Mr. Miller.
Welcome back, Rob.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Good evening, everybody. I will start off with some numbers. Mansfield, using the state of Connecticut's measure for risk of transmission in the community, continues to look pretty good at less than 5 cases per 100,000. This is despite what you've probably heard by now is a statewide upward trend in the prevalence of cases. And you can see that in many of the communities around us, with all of the municipalities contiguous to Mansfield, either at the orange or red alert level, using the risk measure applied by the DPH. At the county level, using the CDC's measure for community risk transmission, you're considered, Talon County is considered at high risk of transmission at 111 cases per 100,000. And statewide, all the counties are now at the high risk level as measured by the CDC. And this is, a material increase from just 2 weeks ago, last time we spoke, when the Talon County was just over the substantial level, bordering on moderate. So it's gone up, unfortunately, in a material way in the past 2 weeks in terms of transmission risk in the community.
Rob, could you put your microphone down?
Thank you, Councilman Shaken. I think you reminded me of that some time ago, so I appreciate you backing me up. Is that better? Good. Of course, with these increase in numbers, we're doing a lot more contact tracing. As a result of this, we've had to expand some of our staffing to meet the increased demand in contact tracing. And as you're all aware, we do support the schools and their efforts to contact trace. And recently, you heard an announcement. Not recently, I believe it was a little less than a couple weeks ago. The governor and the new commissioner announcing a new program called Screen and Stay. And what this does is, the hopes are this will reduce the number of lost academic school days for kids who are identified as close contact. Screen and Stay applies to those kids who are identified as close contacts within the classroom setting. It doesn't count for kids who are identified as close contact in a community or extracurricular setting. But if it does apply to them, then parents attest
on a daily basis to the child's symptomatology, and under those conditions, the children can continue to go to school with their academics uninterrupted by that classification. I have talked to Kelly about this. I know that both Kelly and Region 19 are in some form or fashion implementing, if they have not already started to implement this new practice. On the vaccination front, as I said last time, we were in the throes of pediatric clinics. We've completed our first round of a 2-dose series of pediatric clinics in our larger school districts, Mansfield certainly being one of them. We're gonna those clinic the second dose clinics are going to start up starting on December 2nd, and we'll go through the second round of about 740 pediatric patients that the health district has taken on. We will continue to do smaller scale pediatric clinics on a weekly basis moving forward, along with adult clinics also on a weekly basis. And for those out there in the public that may be listening, they can make an appointment for those smaller scale weekly clinics on our web by going to our website, and there's a link right there on the homepage. We've also been pushing boosters out to all our homebound patients. We've got about 56 homebound patients district-wide. There's about 7 or so in the town of Mansfield, so we're in the throes of boosting all of our homebound patients. And as you've probably heard by now, the governor just a day before the federal government announcement that anybody 18 and older now is eligible for a booster shot. If you're above 50 or have compromised immune system, then you should get the shot. For the rest, those 18 and older, you may get the shot. And if you're looking for more details on that, again, individuals can go to our website. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions that the council may have.
Questions for Mr. Miller? Any sense of what's happening on campus, Rob?
Yeah, I continue to stay in contact with Dr. Ayer and her team at UConn Student Health and Wellness, and things appear to be in terms of prevalence continues to be low case count amongst the student population. I would say all in all, from that perspective, things are going reasonably well.
So looking at your numbers, it makes it sound like the majority of the new cases are among non-students. They are in the community.
That's correct. Very few of the cases we've seen in the surveillance system within the town of Mansfield are student cases. The vast majority of them, or upward of almost all of them, are community cases.
And do you have any sense of what kinds of contacts are producing these new infections?
Well, it's the typical stuff in that there are social events, youth sports events. Many of the cases we're seeing are amongst the unvaccinated in our population. That's mostly children under the age of 11. And so we're seeing quite a few cases among extracurricular activities in sports and youth activities, and then cases bring it home. And for those who may be vulnerable or partially or unvaccinated within the family unit, finds themselves contracting the disease also. So I think, and we're certainly seeing, certainly with the current seasonal conditions, with more people going indoors and the colder, drier temperatures, all of those are combining to see an increase in cases.
Do you have any advice for families holding Thanksgiving events?
Absolutely. we've been asking families to kind of assess their own family situation. Every family is a little different. Every family has kind of different risk tolerance levels. And so I think it's important to kind of assess your own situation. Certainly if the best and most effective way to protect yourself and your family is to get vaccinated. At this point, if you haven't been already vaccinated, then if you get it done now, then you could be fully vaccinated by Christmas. But in the interim, there are certainly still things you can do. Many of the common sense COVID precautions we've heard before. I think one that's I think it would be particularly effective is if there's somebody in your group that you know they're unvaccinated, then certainly they can get themselves tested a day or two before the family event. And then also, if you have individuals among the family who are under-vaccinated or unvaccinated, then, and they're going to be indoors, then certainly masking can help too. I know that some of these precautions in a family setting are hard to do. And so it's just a matter of having an awareness of the situation and doing the best you can and still enjoying time with your family.
Okay. Any further questions for Mr. Miller? Mr. Osberger? You're muted, Charlie.
I'm looking at the vaccine data, and I noticed that in the towns that have the lowest percentage of vaccines, if I look at the town level data, they seem to also have the lowest positivity rates. What would you attribute that to?
Well, I'm not sure where you're seeing positivity rates.
If you look at the town level data chart, the whole metric there.
Are you referring to our report, the health district report?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So the vaccination rates are the lowest. The vaccine percent coverage rates are the lowest amongst some of our smaller towns as compared to some of our larger towns. Right. And I would say that if you correlate that to the state's measure for a risk of transmission in the community, that's the alert framework, red, orange, and yellow, that you will see a correlation. Many of the red and orange towns have the lower vaccination rates as compared to some of those who are out of the framework or yellow. So we are seeing a clear pattern in the data with respect to communities with lower vaccination rates also having higher incidence rates of COVID-19 in the community.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at the Chaplin and the Scotland numbers, and they're extremely low. And then I look down at their vaccination rates, and they're also pretty much in the basement.
Yep. Yeah. So the town level data, those are just strict individual case counts, aggregate counts over a short period of time. They're not really a good measure of risk of transmission in the community. They're really just to provide some basic awareness of a raw number of cases in the community that were identified during a specific period of time. And so from that perspective, they're an indicator of prevalence. It's really incidence rates, those rates you hear about on a per 100,000 population basis. It really gives you a much clearer picture about the risk of transmission in the community.
Very good. Thanks.
Yep.
Mr. Shaken?
I'm just curious, Rob, since I'm sure you produce sort of similar reports for some of your other communities, do you know offhand in this report, so our incidence rate per 100,000 is pretty low right now in Mansfield. Do you know offhand what the incidence rate per 100,000 is in a place like Chaplin or Scotland in the district?
Yep. Chaplin's at 28.7, so which is significantly higher than the less than 5 town of Mansfield currently has. Wyndham also is at 15.4, and Coventry is at 16.7. Those are just kind of examples, and they're all materially higher than the less than 5 figure that the state health department has reported out. So So you can see that in effect, just say by way of comparison, if Mansfield say is at 5 and Wyndham is at 15, then you've got three times the risk in Wyndham as compared to Mansfield.
And the state considers anything above 15 to be a high transmission rate in a particular town. So I think it's fair to say that Scotland and Chaplin and other places with lower vaccination rates have a much higher incidence rate for their population.
They do. The only qualifier that I would point out in this observation, which is a valid observation, is that these towns have much smaller populations, and so as a result, these measures tend to be more volatile from one reporting period to the next, because populations are so small, just a couple of families infecting themselves could tip the scales and put them into the red.
Mr. Shaken?
And just to go back to your line of questioning, Tony, Rob, can you sort of spell out for folks who are interested in trying to obtain a COVID test this week before seeing family what people's options are in the Mansfield area, just so folks listening can hear? I know it's on your website.
Sure. Yep, it's on the website, ehhd.org. But there is the Willimantic a site run by a laboratory called Semaphore. It's at 50 Main Street in Rec Park. It's a drive up, no appointment necessary, no cost if you don't have insurance. And then online, there's also CVS and Walgreens. You can check their websites out. And there's also Generations, which is also by appointment, but they are primarily doing their own patients. But Generations has a pretty large patient roster these days, given all the vaccinations and testing they did prior. So, if you've been to Generations before, either for a vaccine or for a prior test, then you can certainly give them a call. And then any of the large healthcare networks. Hartford Healthcare. While I don't think Wyndham specifically is doing testing, but Bacchus is. There's also a state subsidized test site at Dodd Stadium in Norwich. And so all of these sites you can get details on our website at ehhd.org.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got a plan for how to handle the holidays, and we know that the things that we have been worried about all along may be transpiring, and that is increased infection rates as people gather. So our safety measures are clearly going to stay in place, and we wish everybody get through this safely. The next item and thank you, Mr. Miller. The next item on our agenda is filling an existing town vacancy. We have a motion on page 23. Would somebody, Mr. Osberger?
Page 23. I move effective November 22nd, 2021, to appoint Mr. Brian Coleman to fill a vacant seat on the town council, which was previously held by Mr. Freudman.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Who is the second?
Al.
Okay, Al. I'm sorry. Loud and clear. I just didn't see you for some reason. Okay. Is there anybody who's going to abstain from this recommendation? Well, actually, Charles, speak to your motion first before we take a vote.
Yes, thank you. I was going to say that I've known Brian for a number of years. He's always been a stalwart and upstanding citizen. He has a very good opinion on things, and I think he would be a wonderful asset to the town, as well as the town council.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to speak to the motion? I will comment that we have known Mr. Coleman for a period of time. I haven't seen him very much recently, but we've certainly had him in the audience over the years, and he is an outspoken and relatively wise, as we are all relatively wise people, and so I welcome him to the council. Mr. Kotchenberger, did you have your hand up?
I did, Mayor, but precisely for that point that he has commented and participated in town council meetings and made welcome contributions. So I was simply going to acknowledge that as well.
Thank you. All right. All those in favor of admitting Brian Coleman to the council, appointing, that's the appropriate term, please raise your hand. All right, Mr. Shaken? Are you going to vote no?
No, voting yes.
Okay, we have unanimous approval of Mr. Coleman to the council. Welcome, Brian. You need to be sworn in. Ms. Chain, would you administer the oath?
Yes, thank you. Councillor Coleman, would you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or solemnly and sincerely affirm, as the case may be, that you will faithfully discharge, according to law, your duties as town councillor to the best of your abilities, so help you God, upon penalty of perjury?
I absolutely do.
Great, thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman has indicated an interest to joining the Personnel Committee, and
That's
so
correct.
I would like to appoint him to that committee. There are other committees and opportunities. If you check our last agenda, you'll see that there's a list of committees and possible assignments. Everything from the Health District Board to Wyndham Regional Transportation to Downtown Partnership. There's a wide range for you to choose from, and there are places where we have vacancies and where we need a Republican Party presence. So take a look, and if there's something there you'd like to join, we'll get you there.
I will most certainly look into it. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, the next item on our agenda is the 50th anniversary of council manager form of government, and I think what we have in front of us is a resolution from the ICMA. It's on page 29. 29. So we don't need any action on this item. We just want to acknowledge this is the 50th anniversary of the charter revision that established council manager management in this town. It has served us well. If you look at the list of managers, we've had a little bit of a kerfuffle over the last couple of years, but I think we are settling into the long-term form of management which has been characteristic of the town from the very first town manager in 1971. So that's, I don't think, does anybody else wish to speak on this item? All right, you can see there's a resolution from the ICMA attached. Next item on our agenda is a review of fall off-campus activity. And it's going to be interesting because I have been hearing complaints that I haven't heard for a while. I think it may be that students are just returning, but it will be interesting to hear what's been going on. Mr. Aylesworth.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So as I understand it, it's something of an annual tradition as the weather cools a little bit and the fall semester starts to come to a close, and a lot of the outdoor activities kind of taper off a little bit because of the weather. For you all to get reports from the fire chief, the resident trooper supervisor, and the director of building and housing about off-campus activity. So we have folks lined up to do that tonight. And I think the first person in the queue is Sergeant King to talk about police service statistics.
Well, good evening. I appreciate you guys having us. I believe this fall was actually fairly successful from a law enforcement standpoint for the Resident Trooper's Office. We did start our party patrols, starting with the move-in, so I believe it was August 27th, and actually just came to a conclusion for those last weekend. Excuse me. Those weekends we usually have myself plus between 2 and 4 other troopers that are specifically dedicated to driving around the hotspots around campus and using various sources of intelligence, whether it's sources we have at bars or part of the Greek life that let us know where events are happening to take a proactive approach in locating any large parties. Those do still happen, obviously, with our knowledge until we get a complaint on it. I would say during the highest months, September and October, usually, we were averaging about 1 or so party or disturbance per night between Thursday, Friday, Saturday that we would end up taking a hand in breaking up and issuing any sort of infractions if that was merited based on that case. I did send the town manager the statistics. We did issue 27 nuisance violations this fall. Several of those are going to be to one household. Usually we'll do one ticket per renter. But overall, compared to past years that I have worked in town, it seems like a fairly successful fall season. I worked a lot with John Armstrong going door to door, talking with the renters and laying out expectations and doing those follow-ups with visits with them. And certainly when we do issue those nuisance violations, I do the off-campus referrals to off-campus housing with Megan Buda and John Armstrong. They've been very receptive and happy with the speed at which those have come through. Those are for the disturbances as well as any sort of other student arrests that happen while we're patrolling the area and any other time. So from our end, I think fairly successful. Usually after Halloween, we see that wind down. We did do another 2 weekends afterwards just to kind of see where we're at. At this point, we have pulled back those proactive patrols based on temperature and students heading into the holiday season. I can say confidently, because I was there the last 2 weekends, we didn't actually receive a single noise complaint for those last 2 weekends. So based on budget and certainly guys needing a break from the weekends, we have pulled those proactive patrols back for now. So happy to answer any other questions, but that's about it from my end.
Questions for Sergeant King? I got a question about an afternoon party, and I think the neighbors were really bothered by noise, by the sound of the music rather than anything else. And I'm wondering, have you had many of those?
We did respond to a couple. I think there were only 2 really of note. One was right at the beginning of the season, the fraternity house at 1096 Storrs Road, that there's probably 600 or 700 there. That's the one with the pond in the back. And at that point, there were some infractions issued, and that was very early on. But overall, I have not seen a whole lot of the darties, is what we call them, the daytime parties, has not been a huge thing that has required our response. Certainly, I always encourage them, if you do hear some complaints, please do pass them on. So even if it wasn't something that we were called to that at that time, we're always happy to follow up with those renters and work with UConn off-campus housing on that.
Thank you. Mr. Osberger. You're muted, Charlie.
Seems as though the campus is quite quiet. Has the students gone home?
No, not home yet, or they should be gone for Thanksgiving, I believe, starting Tuesday. So right. They haven't gone home. They weren't home this weekend. They were still on campus, but it has definitely quieted down. The temperatures have fluctuated a lot, but those first couple of 28-degree nights at the end of October really kind of put a squash to some of it. And even some of these last weekends where the temperatures did rise again, I didn't see the same sort of amounts of pedestrian activity, walking that usual Separatist, North Eagleville and areas. So happy to see that, and hopefully we can keep that trend going.
I guess what I meant was I was just driving through campus on my way back home this evening at around 6 o'clock, and I didn't see a lot of lights on in the dorms and very much activity on campus anywhere.
Yeah, the official end for the holiday season hasn't happened yet. I believe that, like I said, I believe that is tomorrow. But as students are finishing their finals, depending on their class schedules, lots of them start to head home. So you're probably seeing some outflux already of some of the students.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any further questions? Well, thank you. This is pretty good news. Did you have any undergrad? One of the issues has always been underage drinking. Did you have any issues with that?
At the the large parties that we actually have to issue the disturbance tickets, the nuisance tickets, we will find that pretty typical for what we've seen in past years as far as the varying population. Your underclassmen that are there are going to be the underage ones, and those has been addressed usually by state infractions, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Aylesworth, who's up next?
I believe that would be Chief Mitchell.
Welcome, Chief Mitchell.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you. Just looking at the numbers from fall semester 2020 to fall semester 2021, our responses are up by about 58 total, mostly on the medical side. Fires are down though. There wasn't many. It was like 3% in 2020 versus to date 1%. We're finding the uptick in medicals. We did add some what we call duty shifts with the volunteers for EMS and fire duty, so that kind of beefed up a little bit and to handle the extra workload that is produced when the kids are in school. So, but overall, for the most part, everything else is pretty consistent from last year's numbers to this year's numbers for the most part.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Aylesworth. That leaves Mr. Ninto.
I just want to make sure there were no questions for the fire chief.
Questions for the fire chief.
Looks
Ms.
like Terry.
Berthelot. And first Ms. Berthelot, followed by Mr. Coleman.
Thank you. I just recall that last year the medical was down, and I'm just curious whether this uptick is consistent with earlier years, or if this uptick is great. It's just greater than last year, or if it's a significant uptick from 2 years ago.
I think for the most part, looking at the numbers from the last couple of years, because if you look at when we the initial stages of the COVID, when that hit, our numbers went down because everybody was hunkered down, and I think now that people are starting to get out more, we're starting to see our numbers go up. And like anytime new people come into town, especially with the new students, we kind of saw a little bit of that just by the age groups that we were transporting for medical calls. But for the most part, I think that's, if you notice, our numbers have ticked up every year for over the last few years anyway. So I think it's a combination of the two.
Mr. Coleman.
You're muted.
You're muted, Mr. Coleman.
I have a similar question to Terry's. It's concerning the motor vehicle accidents. The amount of traffic in the town of Mansfield is unbelievable. I was curious what kind of trends you're seeing in motor vehicle accidents over the last decade.
Well, Councilor Coleman, I've been the fire chief since May of this year, so I just come on board about 6 months ago. But I can give you the trends, what I'm seeing in town over my 6 months. It's kind of funny because you'd think you would see a lot of them at the intersections, and we're really seeing them on the roadways, but not near the intersections. It's just, and I think part of the reasoning is my 6 months here, one thing I found out, there really isn't a straight road in Mansfield. The roads are very windy. Some are wide and then they go narrow. And I think that's due to the development and, going from the olden days of the farmlands, when they develop, they expand the roadways. So I think that's in excessive speed because, if you drive up and down 32, I mean, that road is very windy, hilly. Same thing with like Gurleyville when you go out that way as well. Even Mansfield City Road, even though they have stop signs, there's still a good couple of stretches where, people just seem to be in a hurry. So that's kind of the trends we're seeing in my 6 months anyway.
Are those statistics available?
As far, I mean, we
Say in
could,
the last 10 years, I'd be curious to figure, the rate of increase on automobile accidents in the town of Mansfield.
what I can do is I can research that and give you I could probably show you the trends of 10 years ago, for the yearly report, we had this many, and to kind of go back 10 years and see exactly how many it's increased over time. Because like right now, as an example, this year here, the fall semester, and throughout town through 11/16, we've had a total of 41 motor vehicle accidents. That's 8% of our overall calls. Now, last year, we had for 4 months, because last year's was done right through December, because this was presented by Interim Chief Andy Franklin in February of this past year. For the 4 months, September, October, November, and December, was a total of 33 motor vehicle accidents. That was a total of 4% of our overall calls in those 4 months.
Thank you, Chief.
Yep, you're welcome.
Any further questions, Mr. Osberger?
Chief Mitchell, is medical, is that ambulance calls?
Yes, sir.
Oh, it is. Yeah, your ambulance guys do a wonderful job.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm curious, incomplete calls, what does that mean?
The incomplete calls is just something that we have where it's kind of, it doesn't fit into the categories of, like a hazardous call, a service call, or what. So those calls there, we have to research back and kind of plug them in. And we do that on a quarterly basis.
Yeah, just to reiterate, all your ambulance guys are exceptionally professional and do a wonderful job.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. I have a good crew. They do a very good job. Thank you.
You most certainly do.
Any further questions on public safety issues on the off-campus activity for the fall? Well, it looks like we have no crises, just the sort of ongoing sorts of things. Mr. Ninto, you're next.
Hey, good evening. Basically, typical fall for us again. I believe included in your packet, there are 4 separate spreadsheets for the various ordinances that my department is charged with enforcement of. Recall a lot of these came out of the Community Quality of Life Committee several years ago, and then were kind of expanded upon while we had some knowledge of how it had worked in the beginning. So that's kind of where we went. The only thing of comment, if you look at complaints, that's fairly standard number. If you look at blight, again, that's a fairly common number for the time frame we're talking, as well as the parking tickets that are issued. And this would be for the off-street parking tickets only, where it says parking designation. That's how that particular software labels that. So that's what that report would show. And this is not the complete semester. Typically, I think years ago we used to do this in February, but for whatever reason, obviously I can't give you the full semester of numbers right now, but this would take us from the beginning, basically of August, when they're moving in, right up until I believe it was either Friday or today as numbers. So that's where we are on that. The other one I just wanted to speak on a little bit, it seemed anecdotal, but when we looked at a report, the overcrowding cases are up. If you look at the report you have in front of you, there were 27 cases so far of investigations for people overcrowding, in other words, renting to more people than they're allowed through their zoning regulation number. And that would be per dwelling unit, you would be allowed 3 if it were registered after August of 2010. If it was prior to that, you're allowed 4 unrelateds. And the definition of family has changed. over the years. Certainly, its last iteration is very lengthy. So we do have to look at that when we're checking for crowding and what constitutes the family. Make sure we're applying that regulation properly. So that's kind of what I had to present to you. I'm certainly any questions you might have for us, I'll be happy to try and answer them for you.
Mr. Shaker.
Thanks. Hi, Mike. Good to see you. Just a quick question. When you are doing enforcement of overcrowding, are you, besides sort of your proactive patrolling or citizen complaints, do you look through real estate listings? Are you doing things like that to try to catch overcrowding attempts as properties are being listed for rent, or find unlicensed rentals as landlords might attempt to sell their properties? I'm just curious how you determine which areas to do overcrowding investigations in.
Typically for the overcrowding, it's going to come in either as a complaint or in the areas of town where over the years, and it's a fact, where we've had a larger number of specific cases, and that could be overcrowding, it could be blight, the off-street parking, cars on the lawn, whatever the case may be. So they're coming in through complaints. We do find rentals that were converted a lot of times, and it will be through a real estate notice. One of the things that we do is just standard procedure. When a property changes hands, the assessor's office will bring us down a property card, and we'll just match the owner's address to the mailing address. And if they're different, then we'll start an investigation to figure out, if perhaps it's been turned into a rental, and the buyer just needs to get the information so they can apply for and be registered for the various ordinances they need to follow.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Mayor.
Mike, have you ever considered doing this kind of a search that Mr. Shakin is suggesting, where you review advertisements for rentals in town to see if people are saying there's 6 beds in this place or something?
Is the question, do we do that?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely we do.
Okay.
Mayor.
Mr. Shuren, I'm sorry. You're really going to have to do this in order
That's okay. When you do cite some residents for overcrowding, how much time do the people have to remedy this, and what's been your general experience? Has it been remedied?
Typically, if it's a case where we believe overcrowding is in fact there, we have the most common way we find it, short of either through an advertisement or through somebody just coming right out during an inspection and saying 5 live here and we know there's only supposed to be 4. I'm sorry, I lost train of thought. Can you just repeat again?
No, I just wanted to know, when you do cite somebody, how quickly do they remedy it?
Okay, that's right. Typically they would have, from when we determine we believe it's overcrowded, they have 15 days to cure the violation. So what that typically would mean is they would schedule an inspection with my department. We go inside the house now, and we're looking to try and verify the number of bedrooms that are in there. Obviously, it's not a perfect science because you can have 2 couple in a room. You could have people sleeping on the sofa. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best that we have. And a lot of the time, that's why the cars actually are the trigger and continue to be the trigger as long as it's the same license plates that are there that meet the criteria. But we constantly are running into where we give them the time, we clear it, and then either through just driving by or another complaint from a neighbor, we see that they're right back at it. Unfortunately, it is somewhat of a game that some landlords are willing to play because there is quite a large financial incentive to doing that.
So if the situation is not remedied, those who are cited are the landlord or the resident or both?
No, that would always be the landlord. It would never be the occupant. The landlord is responsible to know the occupancy limit and rent only, within those limits. So any type of action we would take based on that would always be the owner of the property.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Ninto? Mr. Aylesworth?
Just going to add, Mike and I have talked about this at some length, and we've kind of speculated on, how much of the uptick in terms of, the perceived issues or the actual complaints that his office is fielding is driven by the fact that you're coming off a COVID year, and so people kind of had a much quieter year. Now what they see, it's kind of like, they're experiencing it for the first time because they had a year where they didn't have the student renters in their neighborhoods. But I just wanted to point out something else Mike's brought up, which is kind of interesting, is it sounds to me, and Mike can speak to this or correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like there are times now where the approach he's used in terms of looking at numbers of vehicles as a proxy for overcrowding, that gets confounded a little bit because of speculation that a number of property owners are actually allowing students or whoever to perhaps rent parking spaces on their property. So they might not be living there, but they want to park closer to campus. And so they've worked out some sort of side agreement where their vehicles parked there during the day, but they're not actually living there. So Mike, I don't know if you want to say anything to that effect.
Yeah, I do believe, and anecdotally, I hear that it does happen. And, I don't know what number you would put on it. Frequently, is probably a good word for it. The problem with that is I don't know of a good way where you could, you're approaching that. And a lot of times they're not in violation unless they have a parking plan and they're parked on the lawn or something of that nature. There's not really a violation there per se, especially if they're on a town road and they're not blocking and it's not posted, they can be there. And then, again, you do have the folks that they can see they can make some good money renting, just a parking space. So I'm almost positive it happens. How you would police or stop that would be very difficult, in my opinion.
And there's nothing in our regulations that opposes it.
Not for something like that. No, not currently.
Okay. Ms. Berthelot.
Thank you. Mike, I'm kind of curious, going in the other direction, is it your office that fields complaints from renters regarding property owners not doing what's necessary to keep the home, heat on or water running, those sorts of problems?
Yes, we definitely get involved. The actual physical way that the building is cared for is under our housing maintenance code that we adopted when we started this program with the rental certificates. So that kind of gives you these are the minimum standards that you have to be up to. And as you can imagine, it can be something as simple as you have a door that sticks and won't shut, up to the complaint where there's holes rotted and we can fall through the floor and electrical wiring hanging out. So those are kind of two polar extremes, but we do see that, and that certainly there is a process in place. A tenant can at any time complain, and we will certainly send an inspector out to do an investigation.
And what happens if the property owner doesn't bring the house quickly into compliance?
Well, there's a couple of different avenues we can take. Typically, most of the time, we're able to get compliance with varying amounts of work. But if they just for whatever reason refuse or don't want to do it, if it's something that was life safety, like again, unsafe wiring, we would involve the state's attorney's office to actually go after criminal prosecution. That would be very, very rare, obviously. Then on the other side, when we have any type of problem where somebody just, we go through the process that we have to go through, and then we can't get resolution, that's when we have to involve the town attorney, and then they have to take it to court and, you know, deal with it from there.
Would the court condemn the building for something like that?
No, typically it would be, if it were that bad, I have the authority as the building official in town to declare it unsafe and tell them get out now. So that's why it's a very broad spectrum of what the violations are. And there are certainly life safety issues. You know, smoke detection is another big one. We won't, if we do an inspection, if there's no smoke detector in the unit, we want one in by close of business day, within 24 hours at the most. If there's multiple in a unit, and as long as some of them are functioning, we still only give them a week's time to bring them all up and get them back and functioning. So that's the type of thing we have to look at. And that's something that would reach a criminal level much more quickly than, say, somebody had some clapboards fall off their building and they didn't put them back up.
So what would happen if the landlord says he doesn't have, or she doesn't have the money to make the repair?
Well, it does happen infrequently. That does happen. Typically at that point, you have to try and work with whomever to figure out something that will satisfy the minimal code. And unfortunately for the property owner, ultimately it's on them to make those repairs, and they don't really have a choice if they're going to be putting that building out for rental for dwelling units.
Mr. Osberger? Mr. Osberger, unmute.
I'm sorry. Mike, isn't there some programs in town that can help some of the homeowners?
I believe there is through Linda Painter's office, but I'm not sure the criteria that would have to be met. That's the only program I know of in town where there's some sort of assistance for homeowners for construction type activities. I'm not aware of any others. If there are, there could be. I'm just not aware of them.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Any further questions on the public safety issues? All right. Well, we'll move on from here. Thank you very much, all of you. I really appreciate your patience with us and hanging in and the work you do for the town. So thank you. Next item on our agenda is the release of sanitary sewer easements. Mr. Aylesworth, is this Mr. Carrington and Mr. Delay?
It is, and I'll turn it over to them to elaborate on the somewhat unique situation that's emerged in the property that's being the proposed site for the Haven multifamily housing development. John?
Good evening. The action before you tonight is basically just to refer this to the Planning and Zoning Commission and to set a public hearing for the next meeting. But what's happening is the developer, the Standard at Four Corners, is proposing relocation of the sanitary sewer. And there's 2 easements that we obtained prior that would go away when they moved this sewer. So they're asking for the easement to go away. And that's basically what the referral to Planning and Zoning and the public hearing is for. And the easements would not go away until the new construction is complete.
Any questions for Mr. Carrington? All right, there are 2 motions here. One of them is the motion to move it to Planning and Zoning, and the second is to set the public hearing. Mr. Shaken.
I move to refer the request of the Standard at Four Corners LLC to remove the sanitary sewer facility easements on parcels 8-1, 8.15.9-1 and 8.15.10 to the Planning and Zoning Commission pursuant to Connecticut General Statute Section 8-24, and further move to schedule a public hearing for 7:05 p.m. on December 13th, 2021 to hear comments on the request of the Standard at Four Corners LLC to remove sanitary sewer easements on parcels 8.15.9-1 and 8.15.10.
Is there a second? Mr. Bruder seconds. Would you like to discuss your motion, Mr. Shaken?
Just briefly, that we will debate this motion's merits following the public hearing. I'm sure we'll get a much more detailed presentation from John and his team at the conclusion of that hearing as well.
Mr. Aylesworth, did I see your hand?
I raised my hand only because I wasn't sure if the 7:05 was actually a typo. If that should be 7, I'm not sure that it entirely matters, but it does strike me as an odd start time.
Well, I think it gives us time to call the meeting to order, take a roll call, and move to a public hearing. Mr. Shaken.
I've at times inquired whether we are able to schedule our public hearings concurrently. There have been in the past nights when we've had to wait 5 minutes to start each of 3 public hearings, and it would seem like we could schedule them all to happen when the other one concludes, but we'll leave this one at 7:05 and we can adjust our practice in the future.
Thank you. Any further discussion of this motion? Is there anybody who is going to abstain from this motion? Is there anybody who's going to vote in the negative on this motion? Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, I declare the motion has been adopted unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, one and all. And we'll obviously hear more about this in the future. Our next item is the proposed revised cemetery committee name and change. Mr. Bruder, I believe this came from your committee, so would you tell us about this?
Sure. The Committee on Committees is committed to going through the charge of the various committees in town. This was one that had not been revised since 1973, and so we were really updating it just to have it reflect the language and responsibilities of what the cemetery committee is charged with. And I'm happy to make the motion and then answer any questions before I make the motion.
Go ahead. Any questions before we make the motion? Then make the motion, and since it comes from a committee, it doesn't need a second.
Okay. Move to adopt the following resolution. Resolved that the cemetery committee created by the town council resolution on October 8th, 1973 shall hereinafter be known as the Cemetery Advisory Board. Further resolved that the purpose of the Cemetery Advisory Board is to advise the town council, town manager, and other such agencies of the town government as may be appropriate with respect to the proper operation, maintenance, and restoration of cemeteries owned or managed by the town. Such operation, maintenance, and restoration activities may include, but are not limited to, the clearing of weeds, briars, and brush, the mowing of grass, snow removal, the repair of fences and walls, and the straightening and repairing of memorial stones. The Cemetery Advisory Board shall 1. Advise the town manager in the expenditure of town funds in support of its purpose. 2. Review and recommend to the town manager contractors for work to be conducted in support of its purpose. 3. Recommend to the town council a cemetery ordinance to include rules and fees for town-owned cemeteries. And 4. Study the need for and make recommendations to the town council for the acquisition of land to expand present or create new town-owned cemeteries. The board shall consist of 7 members who shall be electors of the town of Mansfield and appointed by the town council for 3-year terms. Members shall have interest or skill in the areas of cemetery operation, maintenance, and/or restoration. The town sexton shall be a non-voting ex officio member. At the expiration of each term of present members of the board, each subsequent appointment shall be for a term of 3 years. Any vacancy in the board shall be filled by the town council for the unexpired portion of the term.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Bruder? You want to start by speaking to the motion?
Yeah, I just want to say that the language in this charge was, thoroughly vetted by the Committee on Committee members, and I appreciate the work that everyone did towards this. And I'd also like to point out that our esteemed town clerk, Sarah Ann, did a lot of hard work in wordsmithing with us.
Any questions for Mr. Bruder on this change for the cemetery organization? All right. Is there anybody who wishes to abstain from this voting on this motion? Is there anybody who wishes to vote in the negative on this motion? Then the motion is adopted unanimously. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Bruder and the Committee on Committees for this good work. The next item on the agenda is the American Rescue Plan Act. Mr. Aylesworth, this is your show.
Thank you. All right, hopefully everybody can see a PowerPoint slide. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just to kind of maybe set out some framework or structure for today's presentation so that everybody's, I guess, on the same page of maybe how the conversation might start today and then continue in subsequent meetings. There's a lot of ground to cover and a lot of content that will be shared. I would suggest that, you know, this be treated as really the beginning of that discussion and that we don't necessarily need to dive into all the details or answer every question tonight. For one, as you can all appreciate, a lot of the subject matter experts that can speak to some of what's been proposed in more detail than I can aren't here this evening. And so in a sense, I would propose we, or the council, kind of tackle this exercise a little bit like you can't tackle the budget season. So things kick off with my presentation and my recommendations, but a lot of the sort of slicing and dicing and probing questions happen in follow-up meetings. So I'd propose that we kind of attack it that way tonight, but certainly happy to go a different direction if that's the council's will. So I'm just going to start with some refresher, maybe more so for the public that may be watching than the council per se. But start off with a little bit of overview, a reminder of what the rescue plan is all about, and then you know, kind of recreate the relevant timeline of the discussions that we've had around the rescue plan funding and where that's brought us to today. So the American Rescue Plan, which was enacted by Congress back in the spring, contained $1.9 trillion in funding. That funding was geared toward or directed toward a wide range of entities, and largely, you know, done in the spirit of helping society at large, in essence, kind of claw itself back out of the COVID-19 pandemic and a lot of the impacts of the pandemic, whether those impacts were health-oriented, economic-oriented, or otherwise. And at the national level, so that was at the national level, Connecticut municipalities and school districts are slated to receive $2.55 billion of that overall $1.9 trillion. And as you can see, about $1.5 billion is being directed towards municipal governments, and just under $1 billion would be going to the schools. And Mansfield's portion of that $2.55 billion is just over $7.5 million. And that's coming to us in two what's called tranches. They're equally sized tranches, so just under $3.8 million. We already received our first one earlier this year, and we'll be receiving our second one a year after the first one. I actually don't have the date of the first one. I want to say it was late summer, but I have to check with finance to see exactly when we got our first tranche. So if it was August for discussion purposes, it would be August of next year. We'd expect to get our second tranche. And just to point out that these numbers that I've reported for Mansfield does not include any of what's called ESSER, elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds that have been allocated to Mansfield Public Schools or Region 19 school districts. So those are about $750,000 and about $840,000 respectively. Eligible uses of the funds. Obviously, this can get sliced and diced a lot of different ways, but broadly speaking, there's basically, you know, 5 buckets of eligible uses that have been outlined in both the legislation and the act itself, as well as the U.S. Treasury's subsequent guidance. and that is to support public health response, address negative economic impacts associated with the pandemic, replace public sector revenue losses, premium pay for essential workers, and water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So I want to just rehash a little bit, as sort of a subset of the information that we received when we did a community input survey. We tried to get public resident input on all this back in the summer. And I want to isolate and remind the council and those that maybe aren't as familiar with this, what we got for responses from the public when we did a survey trying to get their opinion on how this funding should be used. And so we asked a series of questions. We tried to get basically a sense of people's relative support for or intensity of support for various categories of funding. And we didn't exactly use the 5 buckets. I'll back up a second. We didn't exactly use these 5. We tried to kind of frame the questions in a way that were a little bit more accessible, I guess, to the public, things they could wrap their heads around. So we basically took these 5, reworked the language a little bit, and broke a couple out into sort of subgroups. And that's what we got here. And as you can see, so we had basically 7 different areas that we asked people to give us their opinion on. We asked about replacing municipal revenue loss. We asked about upgrading municipal facilities, specifically to help improve public health response or ward off a future pandemic. We asked them about their level of support for expansion of municipal water or sewer systems. We asked about improving access to high-speed internet. We asked about funding support to social service organizations, thinking, both about our own human services department that does this, but also external social service organizations that we partner with, our area agencies, as we sometimes call them. We asked about funding support for local businesses to basically help businesses that have taken it on the chin during the pandemic. And we also asked about providing premium pay to essential workers. And as you can see here, varying levels of support or intensity of support. Everything, received some, reasonable level of support. So it wasn't some things were absolutely bottom basement and other things got all the votes. But as you can see, there was some separation between the categories. And I know I'll have a slide to reiterate this at the end, but we had 400 responses. And based on some of the feedback we got, I don't think anybody would make a claim that the sample size or the sample itself was representative of the overall population. Definitely, I think was probably skewed towards some constituencies that maybe be overrepresented in the data. But we did have a relatively robust number of total responses, 400-ish responses. So one of the questions we asked, if people felt that they generally wanted to see the funds allocated to municipal projects or initiatives, or projects and initiatives that are done by private organizations and businesses in the community. So by about a 2-to-1 margin, respondents said they would prefer to see the funds basically go into town administered programs and initiatives. We asked, this was an interesting one. We asked whether people would rather see the funds used to fund a smaller number of big dollar projects or a larger number of small dollar projects. So do a few things, but fund it very heavily, or do a lot more things and fund them in much smaller amounts. And as you can see, this was the one that almost, demanded a recount. It was so close, basically a toss up, 50-50 split. So, maybe that was a reflection of how the question was structured, or just really that sort of evenness of a divide, I guess you could say. We also asked people, this is towards the end of the survey, whether or not they wanted to be involved in future community forums about how ARPA dollars were spent. At one point, we were talking about maybe doing some focus groups, and based on the fact that strong majority of people didn't seem particularly interested in engaging in this particular exercise further, we kind of evaluated what made the most sense for next steps, and at that time we decided not to move forward with focus groups, at least then. We can talk about how we might want to obtain and solicit additional public feedback after this presentation is done and after the council continues with its deliberations. But we basically put a pin in things after this last survey as far as sort of formal public feedback mechanisms that we were employing at that time. So just to rehash some of the highlights, just under 400 responses, sample not necessarily representative of the views of our entire population that we serve. Seemed to be a lot of not even public support across all things, but a fair amount of public support for everything, with more support showing up in certain areas like funding support for social service functions. As I said, a split between funding more things with smaller dollars or fewer things with larger dollars. And, ultimately, there are a number of trade-offs that are going to have to be confronted because we can't fund everything. And that'll become more evident here in a moment when I show this slide. And so this slide reflects, as the council, I think, will recall, before we solicited public feedback, public opinion on how we might utilize these funds, we did an exercise where I had department heads provide me their proposals. And then when we got more public feedback, we had additional proposals that sort of were compiled along with what was originally proposed by departments. And so when you combine those two, you get this list that I've laid out here. You have basically over $20 million, about $20 million worth of requests. And actually, this doesn't include things that we just couldn't fit a price tag to. So frankly, this is underreporting the total size of the requests that we received. Could be 50% or more off. This is just based on things we had rough, sort of order of magnitude, at least dollar amounts to go with. So $21 million worth of proposals, and a lot of really good, thought and effort went into this. But as you can see, what I'm calling an overage here, about $13.5 million more than our $7.5 million allocation. So clearly, everything that was dreamed up and advanced, either by departments, the staff level, or citizen sort of proposals and initiatives, not everything can move forward. And so with that, I'd like to segue into, again, high level, broad brush strokes overview of what it is that I am proposing the council give serious consideration to. And again, this is really a place to start the conversation, and certainly not the end of the conversation. So think of this as an initial volley, and obviously looking, very interested in council feedback, because obviously ultimately the final decisions about how these funds are going to be used will rest with the council. So I've grouped these recommendations in those original 5 categories of eligible funding uses that I laid out in an earlier slide. So the first being support for the overall public health response. Within this, there's about $562,000 worth of stuff. And actually, I should back up, because some of these projects really either could be put in one of multiple categories or straddle categories. So don't fixate too strongly on the dollar amounts in each bucket, because I could probably very easily move one project from one category to another and change those numbers. So really think about this more of whether or not you like the project. And I just put these where I thought they'd be a logical home for them. But again, many of them could have gone in a different category. So just under $400,000 here is being proposed for municipal facility upgrades, specifically upgrades to the public library and the community center. Hopefully you all received copies of the project description summary document that I circulated this afternoon. So I'm not going to go over this again in fine-tooth detail right now, but I would just point out that this includes upgrades to the library's existing HVAC system. That's actually the biggest piece of that, about $350,000. About $300,000 of the library's $350,000. Also includes the construction, creation of a wireless access pavilion, and installation of quiet study pods, all of which will help the library provide a safer environment. Whether we're talking about COVID or a virus to be named later, these are tools that will help people continue to access and utilize library services in a way that's public health conscious for for lack of another term. This also includes about $42,000 worth of upgrades to the Mansfield Community Center, which runs the gamut from providing alternative programming to creating a number of close workspaces, to replacing shared microphones, to acquisition of Canvas event tents, as well as installation of Wi-Fi service at Bicentennial Park and Southeast Park, which are two facilities that are heavily used by families in our community. And again, all being done with the goal of helping to ensure continuity of programs and services, even in the face of a pandemic, so that things could be done in a way that helps people spread out or participate in a program in a digital format, a virtual format, that helps keep people separated as the need may arise. This also includes funding for what we're calling a human or social services mobile outreach program. Basically, this goes into actually purchasing a van and the materials needed to offer the mobile outreach services, which would be targeting adult members of our community, but also youth and their families, or Youth Services Bureau. Basically trying to help remove barriers that exist currently for people to access services. Not everybody's comfortable either coming to us, coming to town hall, coming to the senior center, or going to their child's school if assistance is needed. And so while this is very much a concept and the details need to be fleshed out, the idea is that this would help us meet people where they are, and remove some of those barriers, and hopefully make it easier to encourage people to access the services that do exist. If for any number of reasons they're not comfortable reaching out to us in the various ways that we offer those services now. This also includes funding for, and this is sort of, I'll acknowledge, a large chunk of this $110,000 for human services programming more broadly. A lot of this would kind of need to be discussed and wrestled with and kind of negotiated. I guess I'll just simply say that a small subset of this is what's actually called out in the narrative. So things like expanded nutrition programming for seniors, expanding transportation options to access healthcare, and supporting Mansfield Farms to Families program. That's really but a subset of this $110,000. So think of it as, probably upwards of $100,000 of that total dollar amount. We could have lots of discussion around the best way to allocate those funds to enable our Human Services Department to provide the greatest value. It's somewhat of a placeholder only because the thought process being that clearly there was strong support in the survey response for expanded social service programs and youth and senior programming. And so we kind of just put a placeholder in there for future discussion around how that might be done within the Human Services Department. Transitioning now to addressing negative economic impacts. This is where I elected to put, and again, it could have gone perhaps in another category, including the one I just got done overviewing, but providing funding support. This is external funding support for area social service agencies. $400,000 that would go to partner organizations. That's about 10 times, to put this in perspective, about 10 times what we currently provide area social service agencies on an annual basis, just in terms of our operating budget support, which is about, I think, $40,000. So this would be a one-time infusion of resources to do sort of over and above things. I want to stress that in my mind, this would require a lot of input and guidance and recommendations from the Human Services Advisory Committee. So I'm certainly personally not trying to name organizations here or say, this is where the money should go specifically to these groups. What I'm saying is that I think $400,000 is a pretty robust amount of money to make an impact. But I also think it's important that to the extent the council wants to go in this direction, that agreements that are hatched with organizations that will be awarded these funds, that those agreements very specifically lay out what those services and what that benefit and value add will be. I would caution very strongly against the council awarding any funds to organizations on sort of just a handshake agreement or hope for the best, or you do good work and so here's some money and we trust you'll do good things. There really has to be accountability. There has to be, written explicit expectations about what's going to be accomplished, so that, while things can still maybe go in a direction we don't want them to, we can look back on our process and say we had every reason to believe that this would be an effective and successful investment of those funds, which are taxpayer funds. This includes $500,000 in affordable housing trust fund seed money. As you all know, you just recently voted to officially establish the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and there are a wide range of potential uses that the corresponding ordinance would allow trust fund monies to be used for. I won't read all of those uses. Again, I've laid out the lion's share of them, if not an exhaustive list, in the document I sent. But the point is that this would be seed funding to get that trust fund up and off the ground, so that there can be, basically immediate impact and won't have to be slowly cobbled together over time. On a related theme, this proposes funding at the tune of $750,000 for the Eagleville Green project. That's a $15 million project in total. There's, I believe, at least a $1 million gap right now between the total project budget and not the funds they need to raise, but where they've sort of mapped out all the funding would come from. There's over $1 million in shortfall. They haven't identified a total number of entities and dollar amounts that add up to that. So this would plug a very, very critical hole that they have in their budget. And to be honest, this is an area where I'm hopeful that our ongoing conversations with UConn and their desire to see this particular project come to be, they've made it clear in recent meetings they're interested in seeing that happen, that this might be an area where we can get UConn to not just lend verbal support, but actually potentially lend financial support to help close that gap. And hopefully by having the town step up and offer $750,000 towards that would go a long way in showing we're putting our money where our mouth is. And as you saw in the narrative I sent out, again, $15 million project, but this would largely be geared towards connections that need to be made to their existing water system, or sewer main. So from there, White Oaks condominiums, they've approached us. There's some history to this, and the narratives that were sent out to you kind of rehash some of that relevant history, so I won't go through all of it here. But this is a development, a longstanding development in town. I believe it's been around since the 60s. Some of the most affordable housing in town right now. And they have failing septic, and they don't have a place on their property to put the septic. And they had previously worked out an agreement with the town to use a portion of adjacent town land to be the site of their septic system. And right now they're in the process of trying to move forward with that project. They've costed it out to be roughly $1.3 to $1.5 million. And they're struggling to find a path forward for that project cost, and they've approached the town to see if it would be possible to provide funding support to make that project happen. Initially, on the surface, I didn't know that this would be a good fit, because we are talking about a private development, and we're talking about construction of a private septic system that would only benefit that development. But as I learned more about White Oak condominiums and the history with the town, and also came to, maybe most importantly, understand the role that they play and could play in affordable housing, including the potential that they may elect or would be amenable to deed restricting a number of their units to actually be affordable housing moving forward. If there was an actual binding agreement offered on their part to make that happen, then the town investing in the project or supporting the project with rescue plan dollars would seem to be, certainly a conversation worth having. And so the $200,000 that's in here right now, again, assumes that there would be an agreement that we could reach on an mutually acceptable number of units being deed restricted as affordable housing. This includes $150,000 in business relief and facade improvement funds and marketing, not just of our downtown area, but the Mansfield, business community more broadly. Businesses, as we all know, have experienced some pain in the past couple years as a result of the pandemic, some perhaps more so than others. And this could go a long way in helping them with, a one-time grant, a one-time infusion of resources to do a specific project, hopefully a high-impact project. We could really, elevate, the businesses in our community and help with, basically curb appeal of our community as well. And finally, for those that maybe aren't aware, there's been a push at the national level and at the state level by the Connecticut Arts Alliance has been pushing that 1% of every community's ARPA funds go towards arts. And so we talked at the staff level about what that might look like in Mansfield. And for us, 1% is about $75,000, and how those funds could be used to provide direct grants to local art organizations, could provide direct relief to artists and organizations, as well as funding public art projects. Frankly, the mural is a great example of the type of project that might be able to benefit or utilize these sorts of funds. And again, that can help with beautification efforts, specifically in commercial areas that we're interested in helping to improve the aesthetics of one particular geographic area in town that immediately comes to mind would be the Four Corners. And as we continue to talk about the Four Corners and development potential and the future of that part of town, beautification efforts and public art projects is one way we might accomplish that. And Linda Painter actually pointed out to me that we've learned that street trees can't line the sidewalks in front of the proposed standard multifamily housing development project. And so one way, in lieu of trees, to do some streetscaping and improve the aesthetics, one way around that. And that's because of concerns over root intrusion in the sewer pipes. One of the ways we might be able to improve the aesthetics of that area in lieu of trees would be, public art. So perhaps we could substitute public art pieces for trees in that part of town. Replacing lost revenue. So the U.S. Treasury has come out with a formula by which municipalities can calculate quote unquote lost revenues. And in concept, the idea here is for a municipality to show how its actual revenues have fallen short since the onset of the pandemic. And the way of calculating that is to basically compare your actual revenues in 2020 and 2021 with a baseline, which in this case was revenues in the most recent, pre-COVID or COVID-free year, which was calendar year 2019. Compare those revenues, but also allow municipalities to tack on a 4.1% inflation revenue growth rate. And without getting too in the weeds here, basically, that enables us to show, will enable lots of municipalities to show that there's been a large shortfall of revenue relative to what we might have expected to be the case in the absence of the pandemic. The finance department's been very helpful in producing cost estimates, revenue loss estimates. And based on very conservative interpretation of how these numbers would be derived, finance is telling me that for the years 2020 and 2021, these are actually calendar years, not fiscal years. That's the other complicating factor. You have to go by calendar years, and of course that straddles multiple fiscal years. But very conservative estimates are showing $2.5 million. And this doesn't even take into account the fact that there could be, we would likely be able to show additional revenue shortfalls in subsequent budget years that we haven't yet experienced. But if we even round down from there, we are really firm that there's a $2 million shortfall, or what we'll call lost revenue, for 2020 and 2021. And so I'm recommending that the town pursue recovering that $2 million in lost revenue, qualifying lost revenue. And without being obviously prescriptive to the council, I think you all are aware that the Parks and Recreation Fund, because of waning membership and lost revenue in general that the community center has experienced, that one logical sort of defensible place to utilize a large chunk, if not the vast majority of those funds, would be in sort of reinvigorating the fund balance and the Parks and Recreation Fund, and trying to replace those revenues that the Mansfield Community Center ultimately lost. Additionally, I want to point out that I'm recommending a relatively small amount of funds, in this case $25,000, actually be allocated to retain, which there are a number of groups that we've discovered with some simple research. $25,000 be used for the community center to retain consulting services from a firm that specifically works with parks and rec departments and community centers on their financial sustainability and their revenue generation. This is something that the community center, if they've done it all, they haven't been able to do it in recent years. And there are, as I said, there are groups that really specialize in this. And so it seems to me that not just, replenishing those lost revenues, but actually making a small investment in the future of the facility with respect to examining its business plan and examining its business model, and having those outside perspectives inform where we go from here. Because I know we're all very interested in and concerned about, quite frankly, the future financial sustainability of the community center. That, investing those sorts of funds to retain a consulting firm like that, that would be a potentially high impact investment in a relatively small amount of money, from a relatively small amount of money. Transitioning to premium pay for essential workers. I think everybody, all members of the council are very aware of the fact that our employees, town employees and school workers have really stepped up over the past couple of years. Some people, by the nature of their jobs and the inherent risks they take on interacting with members of the public, sometimes in close proximity, or interacting with coworkers in close proximity, have basically put themselves in harm's way during unprecedented times. And I know the council has spoken very favorably about its employees, certainly since I've been here over the last 12 months. And in acknowledging that shared sacrifice and those risks that were taken on, even with what I would characterize as being modest financial award for doing that, I think is something that is in keeping with the spirit of the town council that I've come to know over the course of the past year in working with you all. And so it occurs to me that one way we might be able to accomplish multiple objectives, again, with the spirit of premium pay for essential workers, is to not simply provide a modest cash payment directly to those sort of eligible workers, but actually purchase gift cards from local businesses and award or disperse those gift cards to employees. So you have the benefit of giving something to an employee that actually has a monetary value, something they'll use and be able to use to purchase necessary goods or services for themselves and their families, But also then you're providing financial investment in our local businesses. So again, it's not just about putting cash in people's pockets, but actually stimulating the local economy, and in turn, being able to provide a small financial award for a job well done to town employees. And also, I want to point out that what's being recommended here, this would extend to Board of Ed employees, as well as Region 19 employees. And obviously, I can't speak for the other 2 towns in our 3-town school district. I don't know at this point where Willington and Ashford and where their governing bodies are on any such concept, and conversations would need to be had with them. But I just think it's important to acknowledge or emphasize that, however you sort of slice and dice the math, we're talking about a relatively small amount of money. And it's honestly probably more about the symbolic gesture that the council would be making to municipal and school workers for the work that they've done. Is why this is being proposed. It's the symbolic value more so than it is the financial value. Last note on this, because I know this has been brought up by at least one member of the council, and I can understand certainly the interest and desire to see this happen. But this recommendation does not include administering this benefit to all essential workers, all possible classifications or definitions of essential workers across town. So it does not include, individuals employed by local businesses or the private sector more broadly. That's not to say that those folks haven't done very important work and that their efforts and sacrifices shouldn't be acknowledged. It's a combination of realizing that the logistics of trying to take that on, the unwieldy nature of trying to identify those people and administer those benefits, again, logistically, nearly impossible to see how that could happen, and B, the sheer magnitude of that investment to reach that large a population, because you're going many, many times over the population of workers that you'd be talking about if we were limiting it to the town and the schools. And then third, and there's not really an easy way for us to quantify this either, but there obviously have been a lot of federal relief dollars that have directly targeted businesses across the country, and those businesses have had the opportunity at their discretion, if they wanted to administer, if you want to call it premium pay or COVID bonuses or any number of things to their workforce. They've had various ways that they can do that. And so there's not really a way for us to necessarily know what those businesses have already done. And so we know that several employers have done that. And so in essence, we could be doubling up on premium pay if we tried to administer something as well. So I know there's going to be a lot of discussion around this. It's taking a relatively small amount of money and it's delving into something that can get complicated from a number of standpoints, including the criteria you use to determine what types of employees are eligible and what those amounts should be. So right now, all I'm trying to do is lay out the concept for future discussion. And then finally, as far as categories of funding, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So both DPW, well, 3 different entities really, planning development and DPW and facilities, all had a number of ideas relative to investments in water and sewer infrastructure for various reasons, and why expanding our service areas in various geographic areas made sense. I thought all of the proposals were very sound. And again, if the money was unlimited, I think every project that was proposed stands to really benefit the town to varying degrees. However, the project that I think kind of rose to the top, it's really a combination of projects that rose to the top in terms of benefit to the community, was further expansion of the Four Corners water and service area. So this would include extending both water and wastewater service, basically out to Goodwin Elementary School and some of the surrounding areas, residential or commercial areas that could be developed. And again, this is an extension of the water and the sewer service area. The total project cost is estimated to be about $3 million. I'm recommending that 75% of that be funded with ARPA funds, and that the remaining 25%, or about $750,000, could be obtained through one of a few or multiple possible sources of funding. One would be in the form of assessments, just as the original Four Corners Sewer project included assessments. But there are also other federal and state grants, clean water and drinking water fund grants that could be pursued to help supplement that last remaining portion, that 25% of the project match. But really the goal here is, when we think about affordable housing, when we think about redevelopment of sites and areas of town where affordable housing, additional single-family residential growth and development, and ultimately commercial growth can really happen. Obviously, the Four Corners area more broadly is an area of great interest. But the Goodwin school site, and obviously Goodwin is soon to become a surplus school when the new elementary school construction project ends and that new facility opens its doors. That redevelopment of the Goodwin school site, there are a lot of interesting possibilities. And I know Linda and her team and others have a lot of ideas about ways that site could potentially be of interest to a developer who's looking to do affordable workforce housing in our community, and expanding water and sewer service to that area. We believe would go a long way in making it more attractive from that standpoint. And finally on this list, and I can't do this total justice. That's why I included the actual, it's probably the only department proposal that was submitted to me that I actually have included or forwarded on to the council in its entirety. And that is this digital inclusion initiative that IT has advanced. And I know IT is, also, expressing the desires and preferences of a variety of departments and constituencies with this particular proposal, but IT is putting its own sort of stamp of approval on it. Basically, we want to fund expanded broadband to our residents. We want to make sure that all areas of the community, all stakeholders, regardless of your socioeconomic status, any of that, regardless of where you live, that you have access to broadband for a whole suite of reasons and goals, and promote what's been coined digital equity in our community. And this is $300,000 that would help do that through, again, a whole host of means that I'm not going to try to explore here today, but I know Jamie and his team are very passionate about it. And I don't think Jamie hasn't led me astray yet. I don't think he's starting with this digital inclusion initiative. So I'm going to stop with this there, or the proposed projects there. I did want to provide, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a list of other projects or types of projects that were also submitted. I'm calling them deferred projects. You could call them waitlisted. You could call them something else, but they're ones that aren't part of the current funding proposals. But that doesn't mean that they're not really intriguing, or that the council might not have great interest in pursuing some of these. But I won't go through the whole list. Again, they're in the packet. You can see them, and we can discuss them in more detail if the council is interested in the future. And some of these, as the slide shows, don't really have even rough budgets attached to them. It's just a concept of a particular project that was advanced, and for a variety of reasons, getting a budget for that project might not have been possible or wasn't pursued yet at this point. And so in summary, all the things that I just laid out come to just over $7.36 million. Again, the town of Mansfield's rescue plan allocation is $7,543,000 roughly. And so there's about $181,000 of buffer, residual, amounts for contingencies, whatever you want to call it. But that's what I'm recommending, at least to start the discussion. And I look forward to having a robust discussion. And I look forward to bringing in members of my team, if the council so desires, to have more focused conversation and probing discussion around some of what's been proposed. And I will stop sharing my screen unless somebody knows they're going to want me to go back to a slide.
Well, what an immense amount of work has gone into these proposals. I'd like to thank you and all of the members of your team who've made such proposals. I know there are some folks who are disappointed out there, but I once talked to a state appropriations commissioner who said, appropriations chair, who's told me that the hard part was not when budgets were cut, but when they had extra money. Those were the most difficult decisions, because then everybody felt entitled and wanted some. So this is obviously a really huge and challenging and life-changing for the town in many respects. So I think it really does behoove us to take some really lengthy and careful deliberation. There's no motion on the floor. Just a second, let me go back to see. And I don't believe there's one proposed.
No, this was just intended to really be an introduction to this. No real action at this time. Madam Mayor, I know you, in a recent conversation with you and the deputy mayor, you kind of speculate on possible next steps. And I think you mentioned some ideas that you had. So I don't know if you want to share those now or not in terms of public input, but.
Well, there should be some opportunity for public input. I think our public comment session and perhaps a public hearing would be in order. However, I would await the sense of the council on this. Mr. Shaken, your hand is up.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I think we ought to put some sort of a process in place to help guide our decision making over the next several months. Ryan, I appreciate your timeline suggestion at the end of the presentation. I think January is probably aggressive for us to make final decisions on a lot of these projects. But I think it's enough time for us to put a process together where we can solicit public input on priorities sort of as they've been outlined here. I echo Tony's thanks. I think this is a great project. So I don't think we should, I think we ought to be in the sort of soliciting feedback mode of this process rather than the formational mode. I think we've done that through the survey that you put together, Ryan. And so now it's a question of getting feedback continuously as we make decisions. I should note we don't have to make decisions all at once either on these. We if I'm correct, we have almost 3 years till the end of calendar year 2024 to make final decisions about the expenditure of these funds, and 2 more years after that to spend them. So these funds don't actually have to be out our door until this time or a month from now in 2026. And so I don't know that, besides the fact that we have a lot of great proposals here, we ought to feel that we need to encumber all 7.5 million today or in the next 6 weeks. I have some other thoughts just generally about it, but Ryan looks like you might want to react to that.
Yeah, I actually, thanks for what you just said, because I meant to say in the course of the presentation, one of the other things, just to kind of again frame sort of expectations and future planning is you're 100% right. Municipalities have until the end of 2024 to obligate the funds. And then, as you point out, 2 more years to actually get the funds spent. So in that sense, And for a lot of things we might be talking about, that's a considerable amount of time to sort of mobilize the resources to do certain things. However, there are certain projects, including big infrastructure projects, that obviously would take a fair amount of time, from concept to planning to permitting to design and construction. And so for those things, of which there may be few, but they're quite large dollars, obviously, the difference between moving forward, at least with exploring a concept, in 6 months or a year, that might be the difference between getting it done on time. So that's all I've got.
So just then broadly, my thoughts on this plan, and I Ryan, thanks. This is really, when we started this process 6 or 7 months ago, we had a conversation at the council about my desire, and I think shared by some on the council, to try to look outside of the four walls of town government and come up with things that would really have community benefit. And I want to commend you and your team for thinking really hard about that. And I think coming up with a lot of really great suggestions that I've been frankly disappointed in my colleagues around the state and other municipalities, some quite near here, who have decided or seemingly decided to allocate the bulk or the entirety of their funding to one big municipal project that frankly the town was going to pay for using normal methods before this money came through. I appreciate the attraction of that from a town budget perspective, but from my perspective, these are dollars that the federal government has asked local governments to invest in their communities, because local governments, theoretically, the logic goes, know their local communities better than a bureaucrat in Washington, and that it should be our obligation as a council to find investments in the community with these dollars that sort of further the purpose and behind them in the allowable uses and technical terms that Treasury will let us spend the money on, of course. So I think the other thing that I'm really appreciative is I see, if I sort of look through this again without having a lot of details, I see what could amount to somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000 to $1 million of things that are sort of new programs that would benefit our community, that aren't just sort of capital expenditures or one-time things, that are things that I think we ought to consider doing, new human services programming and otherwise things similar to that, and that we ought to then consider using some of the new dollars we are also getting from the state to the tune of $4 million a year in pilot funding to fund into the future when ARPA has run out. So I think I'm glad to see some attempts to come up with some new things that could serve our residents better, that we could use federal dollars to test and then make a decision as we appropriate dollars in the budget process to invest some of our additional state funding in. I will say, just also from sort of two personal opinions, is number one, I would like to see in general us use other means to fund capital projects that would be on our sort of wish list or to-do list as a town. If there are things we can do with ARPA dollars that can more directly support the community, I would be in favor of them. And I think your proposal, Ryan's pretty devoid of, just general public works projects we would otherwise bond for or pay for out of pay-as-you-go tax dollars. And I've made this clear, I think, before, I would like to do some more exhaustive research and soul searching around the premium pay for essential workers, not because I don't want to provide it to municipal and school employees. I think they're absolutely and completely deserving of it, but because I feel very strongly that it would be a dereliction of our duty to not exhaust every possible option to provide similar compensation to people who worked at the grocery store or for Wyndham Hospital driving the paramedic van or in the emergency room or whatever during the height of the pandemic, and only provide that funding because of how burdensome the administration of the more complicated solution would be to those who are employed by the town in one form or another, or by the school district. So I'm not saying if it's impossible, we have to do it anyway, we can do nothing. All I'm saying is I would like to much more further and deeply explore how the town could either directly administer or through a contract administer premium payments to other essential workers who are not employed by the municipality, in addition to funding made available to our own essential employees. But I would love to explore that further as we continue these deliberations. And then I would like to finally flag, just to get more information at when the experts are here, Ryan, if you're looking for that. I'd love to hear more about the human services proposals in the recommendations, the first recommendation, and I would love, in the second recommendation, and then I would also love to hear sort of an affordable housing overview proposal from planning and development. There's some recommendations in a few of the different areas as well. Just get a sense of, and finally, broadband from Jamie. What does that mean? What's the program? What's the funding going to be spent on? Those kinds of things would be things I'd love to learn more about in this proposal. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Ms. Berthelot.
Thank you. And I'll point out that Ron is also looking for your attention.
Thank
you.
Ryan, that was terrific. I feel heard. I feel like you really, you had an enormous task, you and your staff, and I'm pretty blown away of how successful it is. And how much thought clearly went into it. So I want to thank you for that. And I know it was an enormous amount of work. I do look forward to hearing more and for having the opportunity for more public input. I do recognize that there is some urgency, particularly around the mental health crises right now of getting money out. And not sitting on it too long because the crisis is now. My only thing that I sort of didn't like was the van idea because vans are stigmatizing in front of people's homes. So that's the only thing I didn't love on that front, but that's a minor thing. But again, thank you so very much for this hard work and for clearly doing everything you can to sort of capture the spirit of the community and thinking about our values.
Well, thanks for saying that. And I guess I would just say, as far as the van goes, obviously the goal is to get us out and reach people where they are. And if there's another way that we can accomplish that through, different means, happy to have those conversations.
Mr. Shuren.
Yes, thank you. Just a couple of things. One, thank you very, very much. One of the great benefits of federalism is that we can look at other places, other towns who are doing things as we proceed along and maybe get some lessons, what works, what hasn't worked in a very short period of time. Second, a general question. I know these funds are to supplement, not supplant, but is there a mesh in any way between this and our regular budget process? There are a few items that call for matches and so forth. And I just wonder if as we proceed, there'll be some kind of linkage as we move along.
I think the short answer is yes. And then that's part of the reason why, and I recognize to Councilor or Deputy Mayor Shakin's point, the ambitious, I guess, nature of some of the deliberation timeline that I laid out. But I do think to the fullest extent possible, it would be really helpful and advantageous for the council to engage in some really robust deliberation and perhaps if nothing else, generally commit to certain areas, direction, and maybe back off other things if the intent is not to go in that direction, so that it can be incorporated in the budget process. Because I think if we, obviously no one's looking to kind of delay for the sense of delay. I know that every effort's going to be made to move forward as purposely as possible. But when you think about the budget season, the council's portion of the budget season really getting started at the beginning of April, I think it would be really advantageous, helpful, if not imperative, to have this discussion pretty far along by the time it gets to then, so that, to your exact point, things that require or would require an ongoing sense operating budget support or linkage, that can be included, so that the upfront thing you're proposing to use ARPA dollars for can be paired with the operating budget piece and vice versa. So,
any other questions? Mr. Coleman.
Go
ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. I think Counselor Shaken made a really good point. We have some time. I think we were talking about 400 respondents that we had thus far as input.
Yep.
I think we need a lot more. Is that correct?
It was 400 people responded to the survey. Yep.
Yeah, well, we have a pretty large population here. I think we really need a lot more public input. But if you see needs, for money earlier, you maybe set up a priority list of funding that you may need sooner than later. This is a lot for me to digest, and I don't want to see it rushed. I would really like to do some community outreach and see what the people really want to do with this funding. Perhaps make a priority list and go from there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. One of the things that's missing from this is it just struck me that there's nothing for the senior center. And what that triggered in my thinking was we are doing this facilities study to see whether our programs match our facilities. And I'm wondering when we're going to get the results of that and whether, in fact, that study might really tell us that we need to add or subtract something from this list.
No, it's a fantastic point, and the reality is when we were specifically debating and discussing what would be potentially included from a standpoint of facility upgrades, the reason why the primary reason why the library and the community center were included and others weren't, where we focused on facilities that we knew, given that this facility study is in its infancy, the library and the community center are the two facilities basically in our arsenal right now that we have a really, really high degree of confidence won't be moving someplace else. That doesn't mean the buildings don't need things. Clearly they do. We talked about a few of the things that they potentially need, but setting aside concerns about the long-term financial sustainability of the community center as an example, we're not talking about actively considering moving the community center to another facility, and the same thing for the library. Whereas, frankly, almost our entire remaining building stock, there's open-ended questions and discussions that need to be had about where's the best future home or what's the right configuration of that space. And the senior center is high on that list. The facility is doing phenomenal things and offering tremendous programs and services and doing the best, and staff are doing the absolute best they can, I think, within the constraints of a facility that's kind of grown incrementally over time and has a layout and a location that presents an awful lot of problems, things that they can't really work around. And so while it was tempting to say, oh, let's include X amount of dollars in this specifically for the senior center, it also didn't make a lot of sense to put that into a senior center, which maybe in a short period of time we were going to be moving out of, and so until the study, which is about a 6-month time horizon, until that's done, and we felt really, I think, on firmer ground about what we want to see happen with that facility in particular, it didn't seem to make sense to include funding for that now. That's the summary, the Cliff Notes version.
Okay. Anybody else? Because I have another question. I like Mr. Coleman's suggestion that we have some priorities by time. And I'm wondering, Mr. Aylesworth, if at the next time we discuss this, you could rank some of these by time. For example, I strongly suspect that the library and the broadband are both pretty high on the priority list, and we might be able to get started on those while we're trying to figure out about some of the other issues. I'm thinking maybe we don't need to decide the whole $7 million at one time. We could pick some things that we know and begin on those. So if you could prepare something like that, that might be helpful. Mr. Osberger.
Yeah, I'd have to share in the sentiments of yourself, Mayor, and of Brian, that, they really need to unpack this and go through it and decide where the priorities lie and, what the priorities really are. And I do share in your sentiment about the senior center and the funding for it.
So I'm thinking if we get a priority list, that might be a kicking off place for council's discussion. Mr.
Right.
Shaker.
Well, so I see, just sort of scrolling through these projects and proposals, I see in general 3 or 4 different department heads who could come and provide a deep dive and a lot more documentation about what the funds within each of these generalities would be spent for exactly. So broadband, what does that mean? What is, those that as an example. And so I'm wondering if it makes sense. I agree, Tony and Brian, about deciding on a couple of areas of priority where we should try to get some dollars out the door right now to get things moving. And I think I heard Ryan's point around some of the capital improvement projects. If we are going to use ARPA dollars for them, if that's our decision, we need to start working on them now so that we have a chance of finishing the project by 2026. And so, to a sort of different reason, we might need to make some decisions on some of those things more quickly. And so maybe it makes sense to, number one, try to set those priorities and get the public's input on those priorities over the next month or so. And then in the period of time between sort of then or now and when the budget process starts in March and April, to have a sort of budget presentation mini for once every council meeting, to hear from a department head about a particular project and provide us a lot more details as we think about other parts of the plan. I'm just trying to figure out how to get more details without sort of setting a special council meeting where we go through it all in a ton of detail. It's not such an exhaustive list of projects that we couldn't just do that too and have one big dump of all of it, but that might be a way for us to deliberate kind of over time.
I really think that we need to spread it out because there's so much detail and so much to be considered. We will get tired if we try. Literally, you can't manage all of this in a single meeting. Mr. Osberger.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, other things like the community center, the contingency plan for when the Wyndham Community Center opens up and the loss of revenue that we're going to entertain.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about a number of these things. So, for I think we're going to not do this at our next meeting, but in January, start the discussion by priorities. And the reason I'm asking Mr. Aylesworth to give us his priorities first is that we can then have something to work from rather than trying to do the whole thing ourselves in a public meeting, which just would be impossible. So we'll start with a document that we can then adjust or amend or whatever. Mr. Osberger.
Mayor, are you suggesting workshops where we could work on these?
I haven't gotten that far yet. Are you suggesting?
Tossing them out there.
Let's start at our next meeting, and our first January meeting, and then figure out from there.
Very good.
All right. Any further discussion of these ARPA plans? It's a huge project, and thank you very. This is about half of our annual budget for the town side.
1/3, but yeah.
Well, it's a huge chunk.
It's a big number. It's a big number.
The idea that we could do it all in a couple of days is just really ridiculous. So we will have to take some time on this. All right. Reports of council committees. Finance, have you got a report?
No, we have not met since the last town council meeting.
Committee on committees.
Same, we have not met yet.
Personnel.
We've had several meetings dealing with the issue of the town attorney. and we have what would be a very brief executive session that I could bring you up to date on with details.
Did the committee make any decisions?
No.
All right, then, do you want to make a report to us on where you are?
No, I think given the time, it would be better just to defer to our next regular meeting.
Good, thank you. We have dissolved ad hoc housing, so Mr. Bruder, I think you have no report on that committee either. Departmental and advisory committee reports. Petitions, requests, and communications. Mr. Shaken has raised the issue of the State Board of Education letter regarding representation. We apparently, due to population shifts, need to talk about representation or districts on the Region 19 board.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I haven't read the letter in great detail. I don't know who makes the appointment, Mr. Shaken.
We do, Mayor. The legislative body of each town will make appointments to a reapportionment committee for the region's board. I think we ought to put this on a future agenda, not necessarily in 2 weeks, but after Ryan and Kevin work with the administration at E.O. Smith and their attorney to figure out what the exact process needs to be for us.
Mr. Deneen, are you here? Oh, Mr. Sherrod.
For what it's worth, I went through that process when I was on the Region 19 board. I'm familiar with the many possibilities of working with it. So, working with the population change.
All right. Mr. Shaken has volunteered to be on the committee. Maybe you guys ought to talk about it and figure out what the proposal should be for our first meeting in January. Mr. Deneen, are you there?
Well, why don't we give people time to get up to speed if they need time to get up to speed?
Yes. I'm sorry, I had just stepped away for a second there. I'm sorry,
Okay.
Madam Mayor.
The question is, do you see any significant complications in our dealing with the reapportionment for Region 19?
Nothing currently pending. In terms of the allocation of seats?
Yeah.
Yep. I haven't taken a look at that, but I'll be happy to get the numbers.
Okay. Well, apparently we have to do some redistricting. But I'm not quite sure what that means in this case.
If I could just say,
yeah, it's not that, Tony.
Yeah. Another option is the reweighting of votes, which is what was done before.
Yeah. Okay. So we will need a report. That will have to be on our next agenda with a recommendation for what we should do. Mr. Shaken.
I think it's just I read the letter. It is not. It doesn't sound like it's a particularly urgent matter. I think it should be on an agenda after Ryan and the superintendent at Region 19 and maybe the chair of the Board of Ed has had a chance to figure out what our next steps ought to be. All the letter says is that we are required to appoint members to a reapportionment committee, and that committee will make recommendations, which will be followed by a referendum in each of the 3 towns on the same day to decide on those changes. And that's what's in statute. But so I don't think it needs to happen in 2 weeks. We have other reapportionment business, I should note, that we'll have to take care of as a council over the next several months as the districts for the State House have been redrawn in Mansfield, and we will need to change voting districts for people in town before the election in November next year.
Okay. All right. So then we'll save that one for January as well. Mr. Osberger.
And do you know, and reading this language here, Ben, do you know what body we draw for the reapportionment committee?
It doesn't say. I believe the letter just says.
So people from the public could be on that board.
I don't know. All it says is that If I'm all it says is that the legislative body in each of the 3 towns must appoint a reapportionment committee.
Yeah, anybody.
So that's us. We have to do the appointing.
And there's a statute that it references that I have not chased. And so
I
we
guess
have
my
to do
question
whatever
is-
Connecticut General Statutes
Yeah.
section 10-63K tells us to do.
Yeah, the council
I
would
don't
make
know what
the,
that is.
the council would make the appointments. The council would make the
Excuse me,
appointments.
wait. I haven't recognized anybody. We've got 3 people talking. Mr. Osberger was recognized.
So my question is what body do we draw from to create that committee?
My answer through you, Mayor, is I don't know because I haven't read what's Connecticut General Statutes section 10-63K tells us we are allowed to do.
Okay.
Which is what the letter references we must do in accordance with that statute. So my recommendation is that Ryan and Kevin figure out what we need to do and tell us, and then we can do it.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Mr. Aylesworth, you were also responding?
Yeah, I was gonna say 2 things. The first thing I'm gonna let go because I think we've already kind of talked around it enough. But I also just want to point out that because we received this letter kind of deep in the week this last week, I haven't, in Kevin's defense, I don't think I even had a chance to share this or read him into it. So probably catching him a little flat-footed because he wasn't aware of the letter to begin with. We just hadn't. I mean, it's very fresh information.
Okay. Well, we'll deal with it in January.
Yep.
All right. Is there anything else in petitions, requests, and communications that needs to be dealt with? Does anybody have anything for a future agenda? Although I think we have pretty much loaded up the future agendas already. But if anybody has anything. Okay.
Hey, Charlie.
Charlie, I'm sorry, I missed you.
Oh, I think at some point we need to have a discussion about when we are going to have in-person meetings again and a discussion on the max mandate. Just some point.
And we have delayed that until January.
I see.
So, because we really want to see what the consequences of the holidays and the cold weather have due to rates. Mr. Shakin?
I respectfully, that's not exactly what we did, Mayor. At our last meeting, Charlie, we voted to go back to in-person meetings in January, and we discussed the mask mandate with Rob, who gave us some public health advice for when we ought to consider lowering or removing it in town. So I think we did talk about that at the last meeting. We made a decision that we would wait until January to resume in-person meetings. But then, as Tony said, we will obviously continuously be evaluating what happens with COVID prevalence in Mansfield and in the state.
Thank you.
All right. We now have a recommendation for an executive session. Mr. Shuren, are you ready for us to go into executive session?
If you wish to have a very brief executive session, I'm willing to do that, and we can just bring you up to speed about where we are. But I'm also willing to, since we have no real news, to defer that until next meeting.
All right, then let's do that because we have a non-noticed meeting yet to come. So we will not have a motion to go into executive session, but I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Mr. Kotchenberger moves to adjourn. Is there a second? Ms. Berthelot seconds. Now, what this motion means is that we will adjourn the council meeting, but please everybody stay around because we have a non-noticed meeting to follow.
Yeah, so I need somebody, I think, to make me the host. Whoever's set up as the host.
I'm doing that now.
Awesome. Thank you, Tasha.
Recording stopped.
I also, all in favor of adjourning, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. We are adjourned. So, just as a purely social thing, I've had a couple of responses to my invitation for the December 10th celebration. Mr. Coleman, I have not sent you an invitation, but we have for a number of years now had a holiday tradition of a gathering at my house, sort of a potluck dinner, which is sort of an organized potluck dinner, and it's been extraordinarily pleasant in the past. We have invite the town council and a significant other, and we also invite staff who works with us closely. And so I've invited Ryan, and the staff, the people who staff